My name is Jenny Koch, and I'm a principal planner with RHI, or Roadside in Harwell, and I'm based in Alexandria, Virginia, in the DC metro region. But today I'm here representing the APA Sustainable Communities Division, and we're hosting today's webinar, which is the first in our annual series of webinars celebrating our previous year's Award for Excellence in Sustainability winners. So today you'll hear from a team representing the Dallas Comprehensive Environmental and Climate Plan, which won the Energy Planner Project Award last year. And I'll tell you more about our speakers in just a few minutes. I will note if you're having any technical issues with the team's webinar, if you want to send me a note directly if you can, or if submit something through the Q&A function, and I will help you out when I'm able to after I'm done with the intro portion here. Before I jump into it, it's always really important to us that we acknowledge our sponsors, and we have so many this year. There's a huge list of people, and I am going to list them very quickly because it's important that we acknowledge them. So thank you very much to ARUP, Boston University, Burton Planning Services, Clarion, CREA Affiliates, Devon's Enterprise Commission, Dewberry, East End Land Planning, Environmental Partners, L DDPA, Far Associates, HAF, the Habitat Company, Planning Communities, Smith Group, TESCA, TBG, the University of Florida, the University of Utah, Urban Works, Vistarian Consulting Group, and VHB. So great group. Happy to have you all as sponsors. Thank you very much. And thanks also to all of our division members. If you're interested in getting involved with the Sustainable Communities Division, or if you want to share ideas for webinars or activities, you can contact us at the email here or on any of our various social media platforms. We'll have some additional contact information up at the end of the presentation as well if you missed it here. But I will note, from student and emerging professionals events to planning for this upcoming National Planning Conference, we've really got a lot going on. So if you're interested in being involved, let us know. For example, we currently have a membership chair position open on our executive committee, but there's also a lot of other ways to be involved. So feel free to reach out if you're interested. But to get to the real meat of today's presentation, so as you know, today we're talking about the Sustainable Communities Division Awards for Excellence in Sustainability. In a few minutes, you'll hear from our speakers here. But before that, since this is our first of 4 webinars on this topic, I'm going to give a more detailed overview of our awards program for this year. If you attend any of the other 3 upcoming webinars, for which I'll share the dates at the in a little bit, you'll hear a slightly shorter version of this, but you can always find the information packet on the website. But in general, if you're not familiar with the Awards for Excellence in Sustainability, as you can see here, it's focused on honoring projects, plans, policies, individuals, organizations, and everything else that's dedicated to supporting these sustainable communities in general. This year, 2022, is our 9th annual awards program, and we've refined it as we always do. I'll speak about that in a second, but first, I just want to note the deadline for this year is March 4th, which is a little over 2 weeks from now. It's a Friday, so still plenty of time to submit if you'd like to do so. You can find the information packet, which has all the information you need on our website, which is APA-SCD.com/awards. And I want to note again, as with recent years, we're using a web form. That has not changed, but what has changed this year is some of our criteria and categories. One change we made this year is streamlining our criteria. We know if you've submitted or reviewed the awards packet previously, you know there's been multiple sort of a different set of criteria for each award category, and though they were related, we know there was perhaps some confusion between those. And so one thing we did this year is having one set of criteria that apply to most of the awards categories, with an exception for the leadership category, which has its own set of criteria. We've also restructured the categories themselves this year. There are 3 sort of general planning categories with 3 different scales, the largest being the state or regional plan, the second largest being the community-wide plan, and the third sort of smallest being the sub-area plan. So we've described those more in the packet, so you can take a look at that. A couple other changes I'll note is we have changed the energy planner project category to be called environment, climate, and energy, which is really reflecting the same intent, but just making sure it's really clear in the name what that's for. And again, that's the category we're talking about on the program today. And then the other one that you can't see a change on this slide, but if you look at the packet, for the student award category, there will be an award provided to up to one undergraduate project and up to one graduate project, so 2 total under the same category. So we really hope you'll consider submitting, or if you're not interested in submitting, we hope maybe you know a great planner project. You can help us get the word out about that. We'll include reminders in the e-bulletin if you subscribe to that through the division, or you can send me questions directly. Again, my email will be at the end of their presentation. I'm also happy to field any questions during the Q&A today. That being said, I'll introduce our main speakers for today so you can see an example of one of these projects that's won through the awards program in the past. As I've mentioned a couple times, today we have 2 speakers representing the team that developed the Dallas Comprehensive Environmental and Climate Plan, which won last year's Energy Planner Project Award. So to briefly introduce our 2 speakers, first of all, Josh Lathan is a Senior Associate and City Climate Action Plan Lead with AECOM. He's a climate change strategist with 15 years of experience helping communities improve local sustainability indicators through development of context-specific solutions. He served as a technical lead or contributing author on more than 40 climate action and sustainability plans throughout the US and Latin America, and has prepared numerous greenhouse gas inventories and other analyses. Our second speaker, Tatum Lau, is a Senior Associate and Social Outcomes Lead with AECOM's Urbanism and Planning practice. She centers equity in planning projects and works across a wide range of topics, including climate action, economic resilience, transportation, and land use. Tatum's also experienced in facilitation, and she brings a diverse interests together to really co-create solutions that are ecologically sensitive, encourage economic prosperity, and are equitable for communities. So these are all, clearly our 2 speakers today have a lot of experience with really important topics. I'm sure you might have some questions as they're going through their presentation, so please feel free to use the Teams Q&A function throughout. We won't ask questions throughout the event, but I'll be divvying them out to our speakers once they're done speaking. So if you have a specific question for one of them, please make sure to share, include their name in their question. That being said, Tatum, I'll pass the screen off to you.
Thanks, Jennifer. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Just confirm if you see my screen and hear me.
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you to APA for the opportunity to share this work and also for recognizing the CECAP. The CECAP is the acronym which we'll be using for the Dallas Comprehensive Environmental and Climate Action Plan. As Jennifer said, I am a Senior Associate and Social Outcomes Lead at AECOM, and I really work across a broad range of projects, including economic resilience, transit-oriented development, equity assessments, and leading up to the CECAP, we worked on the 100 Resilient Cities program for the city of Dallas. I served as the deputy project manager for a very large team of committed and passionate people who served under the leadership of, on the city side, of James Maguire and Susan Alvarez. So I did want to give them, as well as Far, Brittany, and Kevin Overton, a shout out today. Josh and I will talk through the CECAP, which is the first plan of its kind. And we'll take it to questions. So looking forward to the conversation.
Great. And hi, everyone. I'm Josh Lathan. And as Jennifer said, I'm the City Climate Action Plan Lead at AECOM. And I served as the Greenhouse Gas Mitigation Technical Lead on the Dallas CECAP. I've been working with cities and public agencies for close to 15 years now, helping them to evaluate their greenhouse gas emissions contributions, set ambitious but achievable targets, and then define packages of strategies to achieve those targets. In my time, I've worked across the United States in Latin America and with international organizations to develop climate planning decision support tools, including most recently the Action Selection and Prioritization, or ASAP, tool for C40 cities. And that's freely available for use on C40's website. So I'm excited to be here today. Tatum, get us started.
Thanks, Josh. Before we move into the agenda, I just wanted to credit 350 Dallas for taking this photograph at the climate strike, which happened across cities in the US and the world, in fact, and coincided with the climate action plan. So it was a exciting year. The plan was adopted unanimously by City Council in May 2020. So it's been a little bit, but it was very memorable, and we'll walk you through some of that. Okay, so just to quickly run through the agenda, I'll give you a quick overview of the process, get a little bit into more detail around the engagement process, and Josh will talk about how we develop actions. And throughout all three of these areas, we'll discuss ways in which equity was woven throughout the process. So for those of you, just to kick off, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Dallas, it's one of the fastest growing metros, or DFW is, in the country. In fact, more people are moving to Dallas and the DFW area than anywhere else in the country in the last 10 years. And with that growth has come a lot of opportunities, but many people in Dallas are not benefiting from these opportunities. So the maps on the screen show you the correlation between census blocks with high percentages of African American households on the left-hand side, with highest shares of households who live under the poverty line in the middle, and then also where people have commute times of over 30 minutes on the right. So that's just one indicator of quality of life. There are many that we looked at. But it's really no coincidence that it's these same neighborhoods in southern and western Dallas that were also redlined and faced decades of disinvestment based on policy, deliberate policy decisions. So the city of Dallas recognized both these environmental injustices and inequities, and recognized their role to remove these harms, and this was really central to the CECAP. And I'll talk a little bit more how this principle was integrated into the engagement process, how it informed the way we frame vulnerabilities, and then Josh will continue and show you how these were developed into the actions. So why is equity important for climate and resilience planning specifically? There's a great quote, which I've got at the bottom, which says, "Climate change will affect everyone, but not everyone will be affected equally. The effects of climate change will disproportionately impact communities with the least means to adapt." And this is just a great illustration from the IPCC, who provides some examples of ways in which communities of color, older adults and children, low-income communities face these disproportional impacts. So the examples shown here illustrate that, for instance, communities of color across the country are much more exposed to, for example, hazardous sites and air pollution, and older people and children are much more vulnerable to extreme temperatures. So when shocks or stresses hit us, these are the folks who will be most sensitive to those risks. So specifically to Dallas, we looked at the location of vulnerable communities on the left-hand side, and then we also looked at environmental hazards, including extreme heat, air quality, flooding, and drought, and looked at future projections of what we're seeing, what the data says for the future. And we found that in places where vulnerable communities were concentrated, so the same southern and western sectors that I mentioned at the beginning, these neighborhoods were most exposed to environmental risks, such as higher chances of flooding. They'd be more impacted to extreme heat due to factors such as urban heat island, if no action was taken to mitigate that. We also looked at access to amenities that enhance quality of life, including grocery stores and parks. And this process and this analysis really established which neighborhoods should be prioritized for any CECAP actions that might be neighborhood-based. A little bit about the engagement process, which was lengthy, and I'll give you just a couple of highlights. But just starting with our community partnerships, this effort would not have been possible without the support of a really broad range of community stakeholders from multiple sectors, including the business community, public health, academia, the environmental advocates, environmental justice groups. And these folks formed our external advisory committee. So we had one big group who was deliberately diverse because we really wanted to bring together divergent perspectives and give folks the opportunity to hear from each other, given that this was the first plan of its kind for the city. This group also formed a subcommittee that specialized in engagement, and they were part of all the conversations around outreach and engagement methods, tasks, materials. They even helped us produce some of the materials. We also had an internal stakeholder group, which included city departments, public agencies, all the groups that would be implementing the CECAP, obviously in partnership with some external groups. And this plan would not be as actionable as it is had it not been for the input that the internal stakeholder group provided. So, in a nutshell, the engagement process was really aimed at providing as many opportunities and channels for the community to participate. So the variety of methods was as equally important to the quantity of, the number of meetings, the number of opportunities. The ways in which people could provide input was key to getting the input that we did. So we invited folks to come to us at traditional sort of formal in-person meetings, but we also went out to people. Both the consultant team and city staff attended over 200 informal events, including neighborhood meetings, the climate strike, like I showed you at the beginning. And the city also said on their website that they would come to talk to any organization that invited them, and many did. So we also developed a meeting in the box toolkit, which is really a set of virtual and analog tools, which included a video facilitation guide for anyone who wanted to host their own meetings at their own dinner tables. Our environmental justice partners provided or suggested providing free transportation to folks who couldn't get to the meeting, and streaming the meetings on Facebook Live to make it easier for people who couldn't get to the meetings or just, coming home from work late but still wanted to provide input. My most memorable moment in this engagement process was really when the plan went to council for adoption. So if you all remember, May 2020, everyone was in lockdown, and what would have been a public forum as a council meeting all had to go online, and a lot of people who had planned to attend couldn't come to the city. And so they opened the lines and had people call in, and over 50 residents called in that day to make statements to the Dallas City Council, and we heard some really moving stories. So just to summarize the engagement process, we made an effort to track where the input was coming from and who it was coming from. And during the course of the project, where we saw gaps and we weren't hearing input from particular zip codes, we made an effort to boost our digital outreach as well as physical, flyering in certain zip codes. And we also made sure to really focus engagement and outreach in areas that had historically not been engaged in the planning process. But by the end of the 15-month process, we had heard from every single zip code in the city of Dallas. Okay, well, with that, I'm going to pass it on to Josh.
Yeah, thanks, Tatum. The city wanted its first climate action plan to be comprehensive and to include mitigation, adaptation, and general sustainability actions. So within the CECAP, Climate mitigation, shown in the blue circle here, is addressed with actions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which are causing climate change. So that's actions like clean energy or sustainable transportation. Climate adaptation, the green circle, is reflected through actions that prepare communities to cope with the impacts of climate change, such as flood protection and disaster management. And then finally, environmental quality, the yellow circle, demonstrates general sustainability actions that improve residents' quality of life. And that's things like water conservation and local food production. And as Tatum mentioned, environmental justice was at the center of this plan, prioritizing communities most impacted or most in need of actions across these three areas. Next slide, please. And at a high level, the CECAP development process can be described in about 5 steps, but in reality, as with most planning processes, it ended up being a bit iterative. In steps 1 and 2, we were working with stakeholders and conducted technical reviews to understand the city's challenges and risks. Then steps 3 and 4 followed with the development of the plan's goals, strategies, and actions. And then finally, in step 5, we refined and evaluated those actions using quantitative modeling, stakeholder input, and an equity framework. And I'm going to dive pretty lightly into each of these steps next and then provide a few highlights. Next slide. So in addition to assessing climate risks and vulnerability, as Tatum described in her presentation, we also wanted to understand the city's greenhouse gas emissions to inform the CECAP action development process. The city had separately prepared a baseline emissions inventory that's illustrated in the pie chart on the left and also the bar chart in the bottom right. So our work picked up where those efforts left off, and we developed high-level emissions forecasts to understand how emissions in the community might grow if no further action was taken. And that kind of business as usual scenario illustrated in the top right line graph can be helpful in framing the problem, framing the impact that's required from CECAP action, especially when you compare those forecasts to that declining emissions target line. So you can see from the chart on the left that nearly 2/3 of Dallas's emissions come from buildings in the energy sector, followed by about 1/3 coming from the transportation sector. The remainder come from things like industrial processes, solid waste management, and wastewater treatments. And in general, this distribution of emissions with a strong emphasis on building energy and transportation emissions is common in most communities. And it suggests where your greatest opportunities lie for intervention. If your primary objective is greenhouse gas emissions reduction, then you would be well served to focus on things like land use and transportation planning, building standards and retrofit programs, renewable energy development, etc. However, as I mentioned, the scope of this plan was intentionally broader than that perspective, and actions found a home in the CECAP even if they had low or no greenhouse gas reduction potential. Next slide. So within that big tent approach to sustainability, we worked with stakeholders to develop 8 plan goals that related to buildings, energy, transportation, waste, water resources, ecosystems, urban agriculture, and air quality. And we developed measurable objectives related to mitigation, adaptation, environmental quality, and equity. Next slide. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit now on the greenhouse gas emissions analysis portion of this project. So as I mentioned, the city had developed a base year inventory. It was for the year 2015. The wedge chart here shows the combination of those emissions forecasts. That's the top line trending up. The greenhouse gas reduction targets, that's the bottom dashed line trending down to 0 by 2050. And then the plan's final greenhouse gas reduction pathway that shows the size of reductions by strategy area in those colored wedges. So the city sets a carbon neutrality goal by 2050, and that dotted target line shows what a simple straight line trajectory reduction path from 2015 to 2050 would look like. The colored wedges then illustrate how emissions were projected to decrease in the 2030 and 2050 target years if the CECAP actions are implemented as written. So that top purplish wedge represents reductions primarily that come from energy efficiency in buildings. And then the yellowish wedge next is related to actions that increase the renewable energy mix within the grid. Between that yellow wedge and the red wedge, there's actually a very thin orange wedge, and that represents solid waste management reduction strategies. And then the final bottom red wedge represents transportation actions, and that's things like increasing the use of electric vehicles within the community. As you can see, there's a clear gap between those colored wedges and the bottom dashed target line. In some plans, you might see this area filled in with a caption that says something like, "This represents carbon credit purchases." Other plans might fill in that entire space with colored wedges to illustrate what it will take within each sector to achieve the carbon neutrality target. Both of those are entirely valid approaches to climate action planning. In this plan, the city team and stakeholder groups were more interested in identifying a reduction pathway that is ambitious while still within the realm of feasibility given the known constraints in the community. So there is an overarching carbon neutrality goal that the city aspires to achieve. This first iteration of the plan is showing the best guess of what we think is possible currently, and it identifies those areas that the city would need to accelerate or enhance implementation to narrow that gap further. From a technical perspective, for any of you who might be interested, we used a publicly available climate planning tool called CURB that AECOM developed for C40 cities, the World Bank, and the Global Covenant of Mayors. And that helps cities model different greenhouse gas reduction scenarios. In this plan, we also attempted to be as transparent as possible with the assumptions that are underpinning this wedge chart. So we included those within the plan, on a 2-page spread that documents all of those assumptions. And that documentation is informative, but hopefully it's also helpful for plan implementation and monitoring purposes because it highlights the specific technological transformations that must occur for these reductions to occur. And then we also memorialized those underlying assumptions as specific targets within the plan. And a few of those are shown on this slide for the buildings and energy sectors. As in all climate action planning processes, greater active participation from the city, by its residents, by its local businesses, could all increase the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are ultimately reduced, filling in that gap further towards the target line. And finally, since climate action planning is often and should be an iterative process, the city can review its progress toward its targets through future greenhouse gas inventories and then course correct the plan as needed if those community emissions aren't trending in the direction that we want to see. Next slide, please. So the plan has 97 actions distributed across 8 sectors, and each action provides a primary benefit to either mitigation, adaptation, environmental quality, or environmental justice. And each action provides a range of up to 12 co-benefits that were qualitatively evaluated. And as Tatum mentioned, every action was also assessed based on equity criteria. This included the evaluation of whether and how an action would specifically benefit or burden vulnerable communities, whether an action provides benefits that are accessible to vulnerable communities, and if there were unintended outcomes on vulnerable populations, how would those be mitigated? Next slide. So just to wrap up my portion of this presentation, we wanted to show an example of one plan action in detail. Next slide, Tatum, or maybe you did. Yeah, there we go. This slide shows action B4, which would implement a citywide building weatherization program through partnerships with community organizations. So the primary benefit here for this action is mitigation, and the identified co-benefits included things like cost savings, community education, addressing inequality, and improving public health. Weatherizing residential buildings is important to reduce energy consumption. However, such an action may become a cost burden for low-income communities. So as with all the actions, we wanted to understand the equity considerations for this action. And in this instance, the program could provide utility cost savings, and this could have an outsized positive impact on low-income residents who tend to spend a greater portion of their income on energy. Additional engagement with vulnerable populations could also be beneficial for successful implementation in these communities to help understand the barriers that might exist to broad program participation. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back to you, Tatum. Thanks.
Thanks, Josh. And just to wrap up, I mean, it's been a whistle-stop tour of a much more involved process, so happy to talk more about it in our Q&A. But I hope we gave you a sense of how equity was centered in this process, all the way through kind of the framework delivered down to each action. And I would like to offer, we've got the website up at the top of the slide, dallasclimateaction.com. This is where you can follow all the city's progress and resources on the implementation, which is well underway right now. So yeah, looking forward to the conversation, and thanks for joining us.
Great. Well, thanks to you both. A huge plan to discuss in such a short amount of time. So thank you for the condensed presentation on what I'm sure could have been just a several hours long presentation. Can you all see my screen here with the contact? Okay, great. So I've got contact info for Josh and Tatum up on the screen here. Feel free to reach out to them if you have additional questions or want to discuss anything you heard. I'm also listed here. Again, I'm coordinating the awards program for SCD. So if you have any questions about the awards program, you can contact me at that email. Before we dive into Q&A, I want to note we've got the dates for the other 3 upcoming awards webinars here. There'll be two different award-winning teams on each of those webinars. So you know, please feel free to register for those. We'd love to see you there as well. But in the meantime, if you have a question for Tatum or Joshua or myself about the awards program, please put it into the Q&A function for Teams, or if you're able to raise your hand using this webinar forum, you can also do that as well. But in the meantime, I have a couple of questions that I am curious to know about. One that I had was, you mentioned, Joshua, I think you mentioned a tool called CURB. I just want to make sure that I heard that correctly. Is that's the tool that you work to develop with others to help cities model greenhouse gas reduction scenarios? Is that what you mentioned?
Yeah, exactly. And it can be downloaded for free on the World Bank website. Whenever I need to find a fresh version of it, I just Google CURB World Bank and click on that landing page. It might also be hosted on the C40 website still. I can't recall, but I always go to the World Bank's website for it.
Got it. Okay. Great. I thought others may have wanted to reiterate that as well, so thought I'd ask. One question I had, Tatum, going back to early on in the presentation when you showed this slide with all the different logos of the different community stakeholders, and really what a range of stakeholders, from, it looked like sort of local organizations to groups like, you know, American Airlines and other huge entities. So I was curious to know if you had any sort of if you could provide us any insight into what those conversations sort of looked like. You know, how were some of these conversations facilitated given this sort of wide range of interests and sort of scales of these different stakeholders?
Sure, yeah. Well, they were not quiet conversations, I'll say that. And I think we had 4 points in the 15-month process where we had just massive workshops, all-day workshops where people, we had sort of breakout sessions. We usually started with an overview and giving everyone a sense of the direction for the day. And then we really got into sort of workshopping, whether it was developing the goals and objectives, that was some of the early ones, to really understanding input that we were hearing from different community groups, and then to developing the actions. And obviously, when you get into developing the actions, that's where the different perspectives really start to come into conflict, and really putting something down on paper. But, you know, given that it was Dallas's first plan, I think that back and forth was healthy, because, as I said, what I didn't mention, and I can't really be specific about who said what, but but we were getting pushback towards the end. We had many people, and this included folks in the public. There was a web forum that enabled anyone to anonymously post what they thought. And so we had a huge group of people saying this plan is not ambitious enough. We need to go further. We need to use mandates. We need to do everything we can to solve this climate emergency. And then there were other groups who were saying we need to be realistic about where we are today and what happens tomorrow, and we need to take into consideration economic forces, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think this led to this really motivated sort of ending where there was so much fear around the plan not getting passed because of all of this tension that was bubbling up, not within our stakeholder group specifically, but within the broader community, that we had a lot of people who were sort of unsure about where they stood coming in and being supportive at the end. So, you know, your typical types of conflicts around renewable energy. What we're talking about Texas. This was the first plan. Mandates versus educational incentives. The cost of infrastructure. Should transit be free? You know, how do we really move away from single occupancy vehicles in a city like Dallas, which is dominated by highways and a lot of suburbs, a lot of driving. So that transition is going to take time. But interestingly, the city was very keen to get going and make incremental changes. And so 2023 is next year, and the next update should be coming out, or at least progress on where we are from a greenhouse gas perspective and an update of those actions. So we'll see where that all lands.
If I can just add on one final comment, I almost put this in my presentation. My biggest reflection or memory of this project is that in the end, no person or group got exactly what they wanted, and no person or group got everything that they wanted. It was an incredibly negotiated process, and I think the city deserves a lot of accolades for threading that needle and really trying to balance the very divergent voices that they invited to participate actively in the process.
Okay, well, yeah, thanks to both of you for your responses to that question. I think it's something we all have to deal with on projects often, sort of balancing these various interests, but at such a scale, and given that this was their first, plan like this, and also given the other stresses we were all dealing with in early 2020 and continue to be dealing with COVID. I can imagine the difficulties you may have encountered there. Which leads, I guess, sort of to my last question here, given that we are close to time. And you may have already spoken about this, but other than COVID, are there any sort of major surprises or lessons learned from this process that you might not have expected going into it? I mean, I think you've already spoken about some of the ways this may be different than some of the other plans you've worked on. For example, that sort of leaving that emissions reduction gap, sort of even something like that, I think is so interesting to think about, sort of leaving that sort of drive to need to fill that gap. Are there other things that come to mind in terms of lessons learned or surprises that you'd want to share?
Gosh, Tatum, if you have one, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll let Josh comment on the emissions gap. But I think what was a surprise to a lot of people was we just weren't sure how a climate action plan would be perceived in Texas and in Dallas. We weren't even sure whether we should be calling it a climate plan at the beginning, but we went forward with it, and for the most part received nothing but support from the majority of the community. So I think sometimes reputations and people get things wrong, and I certainly was pleasantly surprised by the amount of community support and mobilization around climate efforts and people that came to the table.
That's great. Good to hear.
Yeah, I think that I wasn't sure what this wedge chart, what the final wedge chart would look like in the plan. But I think part of that negotiated process, it became pretty clear that it was not going to be helpful to just paint the whole wedge chart with colors and show what it will take to achieve the goal. Because once you start documenting those assumptions and saying them out loud, it might be something like by 2030, 50% of our existing buildings need to be completely decarbonized and powered by renewable electricity. And that is a hard pill to swallow for some stakeholders and interest groups who want to then dig into the details of what does that even mean? What you need to put a mandate in place, and it's going to start tomorrow. And part of the implementation, the negotiated implementation process that we took for this plan is a phasing strategy on a lot of the really impactful actions to say, first, we're going to start by disseminating information. This is our first attempt at this plan. We need to get everybody up to a baseline level of understanding of what the issue is, what the challenges are, and what we think the path forward is. Then there's going to be a voluntary phase, and maybe we're incentivizing that. If you do this thing that we want to see, what is the incentive the city could offer to those actors? And then further down the line, after reviewing the directional trends of emissions with inventory updates, maybe we do need to take that next step and make some of these mandates. I think there's a lot of unknowns when you start looking out to 2050, that what regulations might occur from the top down, the impact of new technologies, the adoption of existing technologies. So having that phased implementation approach where it didn't feel like everything was being mandated right out of the gate was one of the strategies the city used to make this plan amenable to folks who were maybe a little hesitant of the planning process in the first place.
Yeah, I think we often run into that in terms of if there's unknowns, if we're looking too far out, there's often some reluctance to commit to those strategies. So I think I can certainly understand why that was the approach that was taken. Well, we're at 12:45, so I think we will go ahead and wrap up. But thank you both so much for speaking with us. And again, thank you to everyone who joined us. We will be posting this recording and the slides as well, and I'll send you an email to let you know where to find that once it's posted. So thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Janie. Thanks to the APA.
Thanks.
Bye.